Hey everyone, It's here. The Diary of Wimpy series has been adapted multiple times to varying degrees of quality. I'm not a qualified writer, and I don't think I could outdo the official release. However, I have extensive knowledge about the series, so I'm going to try this little experiment. Today, I'm going to be creating my own rough outline for an adaptation of the Diary of Wimpy books. This is mainly for fun, so I'm not going to put any crazy restrictions on myself. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and let's get straight into this. I'm not going to go over casting since I don't have any particular ideas, but let's talk about the look of this adaptation. While Diary of a Wimpy Kid has been done incredibly well in live action, I do feel like there is some untapped potential in making this series animated. It could make up for some of the issues I have with the Disney Plus films by looking more in line with the earlier test animation, or by taking inspiration from the Peanuts movie. I've heard some ideas people have had, where the whole film could be 2D animated like the Class Clown short. I'm not sure if I would be a huge fan of that for a whole movie, but I could see them having scenes in that art style to depict events in Greg's mind, similar to what the live action films did. While I said I wouldn't talk about casting, I meant that more specifically. In general, I think having adult voice actors playing the younger characters will be better so that this can be a longer lasting series. That also means we don't have to combine any of the books to get through the story. If you know Diary of a Wimpy Kid, this kind of spoils what movies I'll be adapting, but the series will last 8 films. I thought about making this series shorter, but it's pretty difficult to put story elements together in a way that is satisfying and not rushed. Plus, having more movies with these characters will definitely help make the progression we see across the series feel more earned. The only difficult thing about doing these books as separate movies is that there's not too much to say about them if you already know the plots of the books. I would like to take more inspiration from the 2004 online version, which was a tiny bit more mature, but not largely different from what we got. One thing that I do think is very important is keeping Greg's classmates as a recurring supporting cast, and not slowly dropping them off like the books did. It would be nice to get some appearances from characters who didn't get the time to shine in previous adaptations, such as Bryce Anderson, who appeared enough in the books they should have gotten a decently sized role in the movies. Not as someone too important to the overall story, but instead as someone we see a decent amount from time to time and has some small bearing on the overall plot. The first movie, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, would follow Greg in his first year of middle school. The main conflict would be between him and Rowley, just like in both adaptations. Greg's personality would be more in line with the books and the live action film, but also remove the whole Angie storyline, which was unique to the movie. While this is going to start off very similar to what we've already gotten, I will be going into more detail as we get into what hasn't been adapted yet and what could be improved. And to be honest, there isn't that much to say about the second film, Roderick Rules, because the live action movie already does that story so well. You really just need to know that it takes place in the first half of the 7th grade, and that Roderick is the main antagonist. Although one sizable difference I would have is that I would save the Holly Hill storyline for the next movie, as while she did appear in the Roderick Rules book, it was in a very minor scene. Let's move on to the next movie, which will be a bit more unique. The Last Straw hasn't had as one-to-one of an adaptation as Roderick Rules, so let's go over some details. This would take place during Greg's second half of the 7th grade, and would mainly follow Greg's relationship with Frank, with Holly Hills also being an important part of the story. Events from the third live-action movie that originated from Dog Days wouldn't appear in this. One major change that won't be in this film, but more so in the rest of the series, is that Holly will be more of a reoccurring character. While I find her appearance in the original Last Straw very funny, where she interacts with Greg like one time and she's basically never heard from again, that doesn't work as well in these movies, where we gradually see Greg's development. Dog Days takes place in the summer between the 7th and 8th grade, and before we get into the plot, I want to talk about the current status of the main characters. Greg and Rowley are better friends than when they started, but they're still not perfect, as we'll see soon. Greg and Roderick aren't nearly as antagonistic, and while they still mess around with each other, they're both equally willing to help each other out. While Greg and Frank don't always see eye to eye, they have a far better bond and understand each other much more. Now, unlike the Dog Days movie, which had its emphasis on Greg and Frank, this movie will mainly focus on Greg and Susan, as their versions of a good summer clash. Meanwhile, Greg will also still be trying to get into a relationship with Holly, continuing the story in a similar way to the Dog Days film. Sweetie will also appear here, although the dog will be sent to their grandma's house like in the books. I could see things ending better with Greg and Holly, maybe not to the point we see at the end of the Dog Days film, but it's clear that there is a chance they could be together in the near future. One relationship that isn't doing so great though is Greg and Rowley. While they've been solid friends for the past 2 films, the actions Greg takes to benefit his summer and his chances with Holly were too much for Rowley, so they won't be friends by the end of the film. One thing that would be cool if we got a 4th movie is if the Rowley storyline hadn't been resolved so fast, because that is a legitimate complaint against the Dog Days movie, so this ending will directly tie into the 5th entry in this series. In regards to Susan and Greg, they learn to see things from each other's point of view, and that they can talk to each other and work things out if they have different plans. With Diary of a Wimpy Kid, The Ugly Truth, we're finally getting out of the live-action adaptation territory. We go through the first quarter of 8th grade, where Greg is hopeful when it comes to Holly, but doesn't really have many close friends. It's also going to tackle Greg getting older, since we've come pretty far since the events of the first film. While there can be some references to them earlier, here we'll be introduced to Frank's side of the family, letting us learn a bit more about the Heffleys. With it having been 2 years since the events of the first film, the ugly truth can help push the development we saw with Greg in the live-action trilogy, having to mature and become a consistently better person. Greg and Riley reunite at the end of this film, and it's clear that Greg's selfishness will not tear apart their friendship again. Cabin fever will take place during the second quarter of the 8th grade, as we see Greg try to follow through on the lessons he learned in Ugly Truth. Is it because he actually learned something from the events of the previous film? Or is it because he wants to get good Christmas presents? Maybe it's a bit of both. Either way, Greg's going to be a lot nicer in this movie, and we will see him go through some actions which are genuine. There will be the whole story with the holiday bazaar, and Greg thinking he'll be arrested. Manny's going to fill the antagonist role, as the film will introduce a story here where Manny takes everything in the house for himself. And now that I'm thinking about it, making this series animated makes this plot point feel a lot less crazy than if it were done in live action. This will honestly just be a nice movie showing Greg's growth as we're on our way to the end. Speaking of which, the penultimate film will be Diary of a Wimpy Kid: The Third Wheel. This will be set in the third quarter of the 8th grade, and one major thing I have to discuss is that the story of this book kind of doesn't work with the characters we currently have, so this is the movie where I took the most creative liberties. Instead of Greg looking anywhere for a girl to take to the school dance, Greg will ask Holly, and she'll simply say yes. The bulk of the story will instead be Greg acting as a wingman for Riley, with the two of them, mainly Greg, messing things up. Uncle Gary will show up and live with the Heffleys for some time. Eventually, Greg will manage to find Riley a date with Abigail, and the two of them will go with Greg and Holly to the dance. Things go well until they switch dance partners for a moment, and Greg freaks out when he thinks he sees that Abigail has chickenpox. While Greg made an honest mistake, that mistake leaves an impact that reverberates into the next film, the end of the Diary of a Wimpy Kid series. As a finale, and since we've basically already tackled all the other main characters, Hard Luck will mostly be a Greg and Riley story. We will also be introduced to Susan's side of the family, with viewers now having a pretty clear view of Greg's familial history. We'd also learn about the Diamond Ring story, where Greg's family is fighting over who took the ring of Greg's deceased great-grandmother. I haven't mentioned them that much, but I would love for classmates such as Fregley, Chirag, Bryce, and maybe some others to slowly become Greg's friends, like what ended up happening in the original trilogy. This still wouldn't solve the main issue of the narrative though. While Greg is with Holly and has friends, not having his best friend around still clearly stings, especially considering the current time. This film takes place during the fourth quarter of the 8th grade. This movie is going to be pretty reflective, seeing how the characters in series have changed over time. We reach the end of the book where Abigail dumps Riley, and Greg chooses to go talk with him again. Now this is a fitting ending for the original book, but I feel like we can do a bit more. We see Greg's middle school graduation, and it acts as a send-off to a lot of his supporting cast. We then get a monologue from Greg explaining what happened years after graduating middle school. It turns out he did become famous after all, just not in a way he expected. As an adult, Greg published his journals, and they were a big hit. Greg is a really talented writer and artist, and it's surprising how it only gets mentioned really early on in the book series. Greg mentions being in a relationship, maybe it could be Holly, or it could be left to the viewer's imagination. We also hear that Greg's on good terms with the rest of his family. From reading the books and the movies as they go on, you can tell that Greg isn't really a bad guy, he was just a kid still trying to find his way in the world. Greg then finally starts talking about Riley, and while they don't really talk to each other as much as they used to, they still are good friends. And just as Greg is talking about Riley walks into Greg's room mid-monologue, and the final page in the story flips over as the story comes to an end. I was admittedly light on details, both because of my writing experience and to keep things concise. Who knows, maybe one day I can go to these individual movies and see what more specific differences I would make. Diary of a Wimpy Kid will always be an important series to me, and I'd love to create more videos where I make more adaptations. There's of course only one problem with that. I need to find a series where I'm just as knowledgeable and just as passionate as I am with this one. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. If you did, check out some of my other content. If you really did, subscribe so that you know when future content comes out. That's going to be it for now, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care!